Welcome everyone to this live webcast with the International Commission of Jurists. I'm Massimo Frigo, I'm Senior Legal Advisor with the ICJ, and I'm happy to welcome you on 3 different platforms. Probably you're on Twitter, you're on Facebook, you're on LinkedIn. But we are here today to talk about a very important case, a crucial case for Turkey, the case of Osman Kavala. Osman Kavala is a human rights defender, a philanthropist, and has been arrested years ago and is still currently in detention. He has been subject to abusive charges and has brought a case to European Court with a finding in his favor from the European Court. He still remains in jail. This is a case that you will hear as key implications for human rights and rule of law in Turkey, but also in Europe. And today I have with me a really distinguished panel of experts who know the case at its core and will be able to tell you more about it. So feel free to engage and to bring questions to the participants. With me are Professor Başak, co-director of the Center for Fundamental Rights at the Hertie School, Ayşe Bingöl, project co-director at Turkey Human Rights Litigation Support Platform, Emma Sinclair-Webb, Turkey director of Human Rights Watch, and Kerem Altiparmak from the International Commission of Jurists. Thank you very much for being here, all of you. And I think we can start, in a sense, in a very informal way. I see we have some problem with the Facebook platform, but this thing is going to also be recorded, and we will also put it online afterwards, so that's not a major problem. I wanted really to start a bit to create context and make understand to our viewers that may come from Turkey, may come from other European countries, what is the Kavala case about. Instance, there's been a case brought to the European Court of Human Rights, who's the guardian of the European Convention of Human Rights, and there has been a decision, a very important decision. So, Kerem Altiparmak, instance, what was this case about, and what did the court find?
Yeah, the court decided about 2 years ago on the Human Rights Day, on 10 December 2019, and it found violations of Article 5, Paragraph 1, Article 5, Paragraph 3, and violation of Article 18, taken together with the Article 5, Paragraph 1. He was detained arbitrarily, according to the court, and there were 2 charges brought against Mr. Kavala. The first one was about attempting to overthrow the government or prevent its functioning by force and violence. And the second one was attempting to overthrow the constitutional order by force and violence. These accusations are based on 2 separate sets of events. Mr. Kavala was detained in 1 November 2017 for allegedly orchestrating the Gezi Park protests of May 2013, and for his alleged role in the 15 July 2016 coup attempt. He was accused under Article 312 for the Gezi Park protests and under Article 309 of Turkish Criminal Code for the coup attempt. As to the first set of events concerning the Gezi Park protests, the European Court pointed in particular to the lack of questions about involvement in acts of violence to Mr. Kavala in his police interviews, the fact that the police questioned him about many other events unrelated to one another, and the lack of mention of any involvement in violent acts in the initial court decision to detain him, and in the subsequent rulings as well. The court also pointed out that the acts imputed to him in the prosecutor indictment were legal activities and largely related to the exercise of convention rights. There were also 4 years between the investigation and the Gezi Park events, and the court stressed that the government had offered no explanation why such a long time passed since the incident. Similarly, in relation to the accusation of Osman Kavala was involved in the July 2006 coup attempt, the court found that the initial court order to detain him for attempting to overthrow the constitutional order under Turkish Penal Code, Article 309, and the repeated prolongation of his detention on that charge were based on insufficient evidence to justify the suspicion. In finding violation of Article 18, in conjunction with Article 5 of the Convention, the court pointed to the range of activities unrelated to the Gezi events or the coup attempt Mr. Kavala was asked about in a policy interview, the mismatch between the charge of attempting to overthrow the government and many completely lawful activities in the exercise of rights protected by the Convention, and public speeches made by the President Recep Tayyip Erdogan about the applicant, which continued after the deliverance of the judgment, by the way, and then a further lapse of 16 months till the finding of the indictment, during which no investigative acts of significance took place. Finally, the court concluded that on the basis of these points, the detention of the applicant pursued an ulterior purpose, namely to reduce him to silence as a human rights defender. We will come to this point later, I guess, but I think that's why his case is very symbolic for Turkey. All human rights defenders are in a way represented by Osman Kavala in this case, because there is a continuing pressure on human rights defenders in Turkey. And Mr. Kavala's case is an emblematic, in a way, to represent all human rights defenders.
Thank you very much. That really gives the picture of why this European case as well is extremely important. As we know, once the European Court of Human Rights decides a case, then the question is, what is this case going to do about in the country? And there is a body at the Council of Europe, which is the Committee of Ministers, which is in charge of asking for the implementation of these judgments. So for the state to do something about it. Başak, can you tell us this procedure, in sense, how's been going on, what's been happening, what's the impact of this procedure?
Thank you, Massimo, and thank you also to the International Commission of Jurists for organizing this important event. So the judgment, as Dr. Altiparmak underlined, was delivered on Human Rights Day, so the 10th of December 2019, and usually the monitoring of the execution of a judgment starts 3 months after the stage. So it doesn't sort of immediately start on the day of the delivery of the judgments, but it takes a bit of time for the Committee of Ministers to start monitoring the execution of any case, including Mr. Kavala's case. So what is significant in this case were, based on the judgment, two important aspects. One was that the court found a bad faith detention violation, so that Mr. Kavala was not only detained arbitrarily, but in pursuit of ulterior political objectives. And of course, the court also left no wiggle room to the authorities as to one of the individual measures that had to be pursued. Under 46 of the Convention, the court said that all the facts in front of the court would require the immediate release of the applicant as one of the individual measures that is required in this case. So the Committee of Ministers had very clear guidelines from the court, and it went on to implement them. So it started asking for the release of the applicant to enforce the judgment of the European Court of Human Rights. This is not the first Article 18 case that the Committee of Ministers has dealt with in its history, but it is the first Article 18 case against Turkey. Now, immediately after this judgment, a couple of important events took place. One of these is the release of the applicant in relation to the investigation for which he was under detention, and within the same day and within hours, the re-detention of the applicant for a separate charge. So this was presented by the government agent to the Committee of Ministers as a reason for inability to execute the judgment, because he was in effect released from detention, but then he was redetained for another charge, which I'm sure we will come back to later. Now, based on this, the Committee of Ministers had to make a decision as to what to do with this case. It's where the court asked for a release and found an Article 18 violation. The Committee of Ministers handled this case, and we see this in particular in the December 2020 interim resolution. I should highlight that the monitoring is going on. The Committee of Ministers meets 4 times a year, so obviously it met in September, and now it's going to not in September, but it will be meeting again. Tomorrow as well. And if we look at this interim resolution, which is part of the monitoring process of this judgment, the Committee of Ministers held, and I should quote, that the information available to the Committee of Ministers raises a strong presumption that the current detention of the applicant is a continuation of the violations found by the court, which means that the Committee of Ministers has found that there were new legal grounds for detention, but same factual content was in place with respect to the original judgment of the European Court of Human Rights, which means that the Committee of Ministers said, I'm not convinced with the argument of the authorities, and continue to ask for the release of the applicant in line with the court's decisions. Now, the legal proceedings against Kavala continues, obviously, in Turkey. We know that it has just been in the recent hearing also. And the Committee of Ministers review also in this case is reflecting, what is happening in Turkey, because the authorities would submit new information, and this information is assessed by the Committee of Ministers. We should highlight that obviously a lot of domestic court judgments are forwarded to the Committee of Ministers, and one of the important aspects of the Committee of Ministers review is that it says, I do not see any reasoned judgments as to how the domestic court's new decisions, that it's constantly ongoing, actually is meeting Turkey's obligations to implement the Kavala judgment. So it has repeatedly underlined that the domestic courts are failing to implement the judgment of the European Court of Human Rights. This case is under a regular monitoring process by the Committee of Ministers for 2 reasons, again, the same reasons, because it's an Article 18 violation and because the court asked for the release of the applicant. So every 3 months, this has to be debated by the Committee of Ministers. And we see very similar resolutions by the Committee of Ministers in response to the authorities' explanations that he is detained for a different charge, and there are different proceedings, and these don't apply. And you would see a very large volume of documentation on the website of the Committee of Ministers in relation to this. This brings us this back and forth, basically Turkey contesting the request to release, and the Committee of Ministers explaining to Turkey that the judgment requires, as one step, the release, but obviously it's not the only step to give full effect to the judgment. It brings us to the latest resolution that is been much debated, and this is the September 2021 decision of the Committee of Ministers. Now, in this decision, the Committee of Ministers gave, after a lot of back and forth, right? So this is ongoing for quite some time. So this was expected in that way. It gave a final warning to the Turkish authorities. And it said that if the applicant, as per the judgment of the European Court of Human Rights, is not released by 30th of November 2021, the Committee of Ministers would have to be in a position to give formal notification of infringement proceedings against Turkey. So this is where we are. We are on the 29th of November. The Committee of Ministers will meet tomorrow on the 30th of November, it will deliberate on Kavala's case, but not only on Kavala's case, on a very large volume of very important human rights cases all around Council of Europe member states. And we will find out after the 2nd of December, I should add, when after the meetings, and we will see what the decisions are taken. So we're at the point that Turkey may be subject to infringement proceedings for its persistent non-compliance with a judgment of the European Court of Human Rights concerning a human rights defender.
Thank you very much. And that really explains really what is at stake. Tomorrow, we really have a momentum decision, both for the Council of Europe, also for Turkey, about the importance of implementing a human rights judgment and the situation of human rights in Turkey. It's also interesting to understand, in a sense, how we got there, in the sense, all of our organizations, we have been following the case of Osman Kavala, both through trial monitoring, by going to the courts, by presenting findings on the situations to the Committee of Ministers intervening in court. Emma Sinclair-Webb says, how were the domestic proceedings? How did we got here, basically? What happened to Osman Kavala in courts in Turkey?
Thank you very much, and thank you for organizing this event to ICJ. I'm sure Başak, Çalı and others will come back to the issue of what infringement proceedings can mean, because this is the question that I think all of us are being asked now by journalists, especially, is what's the significance of infringement procedure? What kind of sanction is it? And it's a very kind of uncharted territory in a way. It's a very gray area because it's so rare. But I'm going to explain briefly some striking things about the domestic proceedings, because I think this often is very difficult to explain to the world, but because it is just so convoluted. And I'm going to take a step back to what Kerem Altiparmak was saying. He was describing the initial detention, how Osman Kavala was detained, first of all, in relation to two separate events, and the events being the Gezi Park protests and the 15th of July 2016 attempted coup. But what preceded was the Gezi Park aspect of this, in terms of an indictment that came 16 months after Kavala's initial detention. The coup part seemed to be left aside. And we started off with a prosecution of him for financing and organizing the Gezi Park protests, along with 15 other people in the case. And that trial ran for a few hearings, and then resulted in an acquittal back in February 2020. So February the 18th, 2020, there was an acquittal of Osman Kavala and the rest on that Gezi Park trial case. But then, as Başak Çalı said, he was immediately redetained the day later in connection with the other leg of the whole accusations against him, which was in connection with the coup attempt of 2016 and the charge that he was originally detained on for that aspect. So then, same facts, no new facts presented, but a redetention despite the acquittal. And a kind of, in a way, like a relay race, where someone passes the baton on to the next runner. The people run and then the baton gets passed on. So basically, we move from the Gezi Park part of the case to the coup plot aspect. And out comes another indictment against Osman Kavala. And then another charge is added. But the other charge is again based on the same facts, again going back to Gezi and the coup plot. So you get another indictment coming, a different charge on which to prolong the detention. But no new substantive evidence to undercut what the European Court is saying. The European Court having ordered the release on the basis of insufficient evidence, on the basis of the facts, what we have then is renaming of the same facts. The charge is renamed. You have on the basis, but the facts are the same, and that's the absolutely unlawful part of all of this, and the way in which Turkey has tried to circumvent the European Court decision by saying we've already carried it out, we've already released him on what you found us insufficient on. Now there's another charge. This is different. And the European and the Committee of Ministers, as we've said, has continually come back to the same point. No, it's part of the same facts. No, we don't think it's a different process. It's the same process going on under a different name. So that's the very difficult thing to explain. And what we've seen this year, I think, is particularly striking in that there's been an effort, but there's been a new indictment focusing on the coup plot and incidents that happened on an island where a group of academics met, all irrelevant to actually Osman Kavala, but nevertheless brought into the picture. And then we got the new indictment from last year was combined, merged with the Gezi Park trial, which got overturned at appeal. And then a third element was brought in, which is another trial concerning Gezi Park, which was about a group of football fans from the group called Carşı, which is the Beşiktaş football team. 35 football fans and others faced back in 2014 a trial for conducting a slightly rowdy protest near Beşiktaş, which is some kilometers away from Gezi Park. But it was in the midst of the Gezi Park protests, and it was a one event on the 16th of June 2013, for which these 35 fans went on trial in 2014. Now, this is way before Osman Kavala was detained. It's nothing to do with Osman Kavala, a whole 3 years before he was detained. But that old trial, for which everyone was largely acquitted, reappeared this year, over 5 years after the original acquittals for this protest. It appeared again and has been now, Osman Kavala's trial has been merged with this. So we've now got a trial of 52 defendants, and we've had just last week on Friday another hearing in that ongoing trial. It is very difficult to explain, but one of the appalling things about this, and it's worth stating here, is that they brought in order to prolong Osman Kavala's detention, another set of proceedings where there is no factual basis there's no factual link between Osman Kavala and those defendants. They don't know each other. There's no evidence or even assertion that they know each other. There's no allegation to that effect. But because Osman Kavala is being charged with being the mastermind of the Gezi Park protests, therefore anything that happens during Gezi Park is being argued to be legitimately connected, therefore, with Osman Kavala, and he can somehow be held responsible for sort of a series of unrelated events that make up a different trial proceeding altogether. And I think one of the most extraordinary things we've seen this year is that the trial of these football protesters was actually one that everyone thought was dead and gone and finished. We thought they'd been acquitted and it was over. But we didn't realize that it was still lying dormant in the Court of Cassation, waiting on a shelf for this day when it could be revived and merged with Osman Kavala's trial. And that is over 5 years after the acquittal in that trial happened. So to wait 5 years to rejuvenate a trial, reinvigorate a trial is a pretty suspicious sign in itself. And that shows that really this is being used as a pretext on which to maintain the proceedings against Osman Kavala by adding a new element to basically justify the long detention. And we've got, there are some very acute technical parts of all this, which including the fact that when Osman Kavala's Gezi prosecution, Gezi acquittal was overturned, the local court of appeal in January of this year, which overturned it, suddenly referred to this trial against the 35 Carşı football supporters. Now, it's extraordinary that in an appeal, in a decision of overturning an acquittal, a regional court of appeal would refer to a completely other separate trial, nothing to do with the facts at hand, and bring that into the picture. And you have to ask, where did that come from? Why did the Court of Appeal think about the Carşı trial? Where did it get the idea from? It was not in the file. So how did it invent the connection between the two? So that's one big, very, very big question mark. Now that acquittal, overturning the acquittal, came in January 2021. And in March 2021, the top court of cassation suddenly overturned the acquittal in the Carşı trial. So it's almost like the local regional court of appeal gave the idea to the top court of cassation that it needed to do something about that Carşı trial and overturn it, so that the two could be, the Osman Kavala trial could be sort of merged with it. And we have also a very extraordinary thing that the Court of Cassation on the Carşı trial actually makes the argument that this trial should be connected with the Osman Kavala trial. And that's also extraordinary. Why would the Court of Cassation think of a quite separate set of proceedings and decide to merge them when it didn't have in the case file in front of it anything about Osman Kavala? So therefore, this leads to, of course, the strong suspicion that we have, which is that this is something essentially within the judiciary has been concocted, perhaps by people in the higher courts, perhaps by the board of judges and prosecutors. We don't know exactly where it comes from, but this seems to be someone's idea to put these two dossiers together, because no court on its own could have come up with that in terms of procedural practice in Turkey and anywhere else. This is not something in criminal procedure that could have occurred just on the initiative of a court. So this raises a very concerning thing of machinations within the judiciary to sort of mix up dossiers, prepare joinder decisions in ways that are entirely unlawful.
Oh, so that's really striking how even in the case of Osman Kavala, since the beginning, it says already thinking, this case started in 2017, the Gezi events were years before. So there is always something hanging, a thread hanging there that is used in arbitrary moments. And if someone, I still remember reading the indictment of the Gezi Park trial, an indictment, I remember I said, no one would even pass law school having written that indictment, because there are only 2 pages of legal reasoning on 659, if I remember correctly, and a patchwork of non-evidence. It was quite striking. And it's striking to see all this, basically every time there is a development, there is some card to pick out of the draw and really show there. And the last time was last Friday, in the sense, again, we have a European Court judgment. We have the Committee of Ministers saying that he should be released. And last Friday, again, he remains in detention. So Ayşe Bingöl, why courts in Turkey do not want to implement the European Court judgment?
That's a very hard question, but let's see if we could reflect on it, because what we have been discussing so far by all the speakers have been through months of work on the case files, on the developments in the domestic procedure, analysis of the European Court's judgment, and 4 submissions made to the Committee of Ministers by a coalition of NGOs. And it hasn't been easy to put together all this information, because as we have been discussing, the judiciary in Turkey has been adopting tactics based on the developments before the Committee of Ministers or the developments in the European Court of Human Rights case, before the judgment was handed down. And it is a way, a kind of, not a good, but it is a kind of conversation between the Turkish courts and the international, that European Council organs, in relation to what are Turkey's obligations in this case, what in defining the violations or in deciding the next steps to take. And I think that the interventions of the NGOs and also that regular information coming from the lawyers of Osman Kavala and in similar cases, the lawyers involved in these cases are vitally important. And why the courts are not implementing the judgment touches upon many important points. And I think the most important one is actually, we can see it from the court's own judgment in relation to Article 18 violation aspect of the case, finding that in detention of Osman Kavala, finding a political purpose. And that political purpose means that Osman Kavala, who has been detained as a human rights defender, as a civil society leader, not for a genuine prosecution, what is necessary for carrying out a genuine prosecution, a genuine trial, and based on a reasonable suspicion whatsoever. So the court found that very clearly his detention pursued a political aim. And what is that political aim? Could give us some signs of why the courts are not implementing this judgment. Because Osman Kavala, as a human rights defender, was carrying out activities that the current government, which was the same government at the time of his initial detention, was not happy about. It was not in line with the policies of the government. So his activities created kind of a reaction at the government side. And when we think about the actions of the judiciary, again, we can go through the court's finding in relation to the situation of the judiciary, which is openly defined, defines it, makes strong references and acceptance of the influence or the control of the government over the judiciary. So questions around independence and impartiality of the judiciary. So I think that what we can say in relation to that question is the political purpose, whatever purpose the government or the Turkish authorities are pursuing by keeping him behind the bars, is still there. So there is still something that is expected as an outcome of his ongoing detention by the current authorities. And since the judiciary in Turkey has systemic issues around its independence and impartiality, and the control of the executive on the judiciary is very real and ongoing, the judiciary would not be able to release Osman Kavala unless that political purpose changes, unless the government in Turkey, openly tells the judiciary that release Osman Kavala. I think this is a very clear case, because what Emma described, what Kerem and Başak described in relation to the situation, all aspects of the case, brings us to that conclusion. The European Court in its judgments clearly finds a kind of a rhythm between the president's speeches targeting Osman Kavala and the judicial actions taken against Osman Kavala. So there's a sequence of president's statements about Osman Kavala and all these judicial actions, tactics adopted to keep him behind bar. And this is still ongoing. Also, we have seen what happened following the declaration made by 10 ambassadors in Turkey asking for his pre-trial release. The president declared them a persona non grata, and then he openly made speeches targeting Osman Kavala, or continued making those speeches. And when we think about a judiciary which is not independent of those executive interferences, I think that it would be very unlikely to expect the judiciary to implement those judgments, this judgment, especially in relation to release, his immediate release. But having said that, I think this ongoing supervision of the Committee of Ministers is vital and very important. What we see, yes, it's correct that there's a resistance at the Turkish authorities' side, and that resistance is still there. But I think they are closely watching what is happening at the Committee of Ministers level. We see that, for example, from the government authorities, like Turkish authorities, continuing submissions to the Committee of Ministers. So they are involved in the process, they are watching the process, and what is going to happen before the Committee of Ministers will have an impact eventually on Turkey. So I think it is important to underline that. And I think one of the important aspects of this case, we shouldn't undermine the personal toll this ongoing detention has on Osman Kavala and all other political prisoners in Turkey. And in his recent interviews, I think he clearly indicates that this clear picture about this case not being just about his case, not being an isolated situation, isolated case in Turkey, and any positive developments in this case having an impact on the larger systemic issues in Turkey in relation to other arbitrary detentions or other arbitrary proceedings as well. So what is happening in Turkey? Of course, we can go into the details of the lack of education of the judges and prosecutors in Turkey as well. Whether they do have a clear and good understanding of the laws or Turkey's international obligations and how they are binding on them. But I think that in this specific case, what we see in every single decisions, and that includes the Constitutional Court as well, because the Constitutional Court delivered 2 judgments in Osman Kavala's case, and the second one came after the ECHR's judgment, which was a clear guidance to the Constitutional Court, and they didn't find a violation, although it was a majority decision. It was still a Constitutional Court decision. And of course, that was a result of the government's interference in the Constitutional Court's composition as well. But I think that the fact that neither of domestic authorities in Turkey, including prosecutors, judges, courts, and eventually the Constitutional Court, appeal courts, regional courts, not making even a single reference to the European Court's judgment in their decisions, in their evaluation, this is the same for last Friday's continuation of the detention order, is a clear sign of why the judgment is not implemented, because there is a political reason there, and they don't have that courage to reference it, because they cannot say something against that judgment. This is what I think about that question, which is very striking. So I think that with the Committee of Ministers' ongoing supervision, that resistance will eventually kind of have to stop, and Osman Kavala will have to be released. But currently, the political purpose aimed out of his detention is still there, and that is why the implementation of the judgment proves to be very challenging.
That's very interesting, because that's very interesting, and particularly is very discouraging as to see that this case is a blueprint. It's a blueprint of what's going on in Turkey. It really shows all the symptoms and all the points that actually matter and touch upon not only Osman Kavala, but Turkish people as such. I want to throw a question there, in a sense, for any of you who wants to answer, which is really, okay, Emma was referring to that question, and probably we should explain. Tomorrow, the Committee of Ministers of the Council of Europe will have to consider, after having threatened it, whether to start the infringement procedures on Turkey, a decision that has been taken up to now only once against Azerbaijan in the Mammadov case. What is an infringement decision, and what does it entail? What happens to a state that then goes through an infringement procedure? Who would like to answer? Başak, maybe? I try the professor.
Sure. I'll happy to start. I'm sure there's more to add to it. Infringement procedure is a new addition to the European Convention system. So it's not something that existed right from when the convention was drafted in 1950. And one of the reasons why it was sort of included in the amendment of Article 46 was to really address either some major interpretive unclarity with the judgments, or to address these systemic refusals to actually implement the judgments of the European Court of Human Rights. Sometimes it's, I think, incorrectly, and I have also made this mistake, so I'd like to be honest about it. It's, I think, incorrectly is called the nuclear option. There's nothing absolutely nuclear about the infringement proceedings. But why is it called a nuclear option? Because it requires 2/3 of the Council of Europe member states at the very minimum to trigger infringement proceedings. So I think this is maybe why, but there's absolutely nothing nuclear about it. What does it mean? When the infringement proceedings are initiated against a state, which happened only once, as you highlighted in relation to Azerbaijan, the case goes back to the European Court of Human Rights. The European Court of Human Rights has to assemble in a grand chamber formation, and it has to assess whether the state in question is really genuinely refusing to implement its judgment. So this is what the decision is about. It won't be about anything that Kavala has been going through in all the trials that Emma underlined, but whether the original judgment was really in a very clear-cut case of non-implementation. Once the infringement proceedings are triggered, there's also a long time between the triggering of a procedure and the court seizing of the case and then delivering its infringement proceeding decision, which obviously in an urgent detention case for a human being for over 4 years, we wouldn't be able to know exactly how long this would take. It would maybe take even a year or longer. I wouldn't be able to tell the time for that. So if the court, when the court, not if, but when the court delivers a judgment on infringement, I don't think it's legally very complicated, because this court has already ordered the release of the applicant as the first urgent individual measure. We should highlight that that's not the only measure in this case. A person who's been in unlawful detention on bogus charges, all of his civil rights and obligations will have to be restored, obviously. There's not a very complex legal case here. But when the court decides, it sends the judgment back to the Committee of Ministers. And as Ayşe highlighted, this judgment will be translated, sent to the courts, for them to take, obviously, to implement it. And perhaps others might come on then what, once this happens and then the judgment is delivered, maybe others may want to comment on it. Infringement proceedings from a more political psychology perspective, though, are usually regarded as highly embarrassing situations for a state to be in. So it's an embarrassment in a way to be in a situation where you're referred to about your non-implementation of a judgment. But I don't know whether the social psychological kind of pressure would actually meet its audience in this context. But let me leave it there for the moment.
Thank you. So that's what the process and the decision will be. And I think on this discussion, we have also been hearing that this is a very peculiar case and a symbolic case. So if there's going to be an infringement decision, or at least a decision to bring it upon, because of course it will be first an interim decision, and then there will be the second decision of the Committee of Ministers that we need really put it to the European Court. This is, probably it's also important because the systemic attitude. This is, I don't know, Ayşe, Emma, any of you, what's the impact for Turkey of this judgment? Is if the Committee of Ministers were to say, okay, we really want to use the option to go back to the European Court of Human Rights, what did we show about Turkey? And would you send a signal beyond Kavala, and to whom?
As Başak mentioned, infringement proceedings are triggered very rarely once so far in the history of the Council of Europe, and Turkey has been the member of the Council for very close to its beginning, and that's being triggered against a kind of a long lasting member of the Council it does have meaning for Turkey. It should have a meaning for Turkey too. And I think in one of his speeches, the president mentioned that they will keep an eye on the developments in the Council of Europe. And if that is triggered, I think that will have an impact on the current situation in Turkey. In what way? This is to be seen, because the current climate in Turkey is not very promising in relation to kind of a shift in its policies with regard to human rights law or human rights or rule of law issues, systemic issues in the country. But I think that if the Committee of Ministers decides to trigger the infringement proceeding, that will have definitely have caused lots of discussions internally around this decision, and it will give a very strong tool to the human rights community, and also whoever is subject of this decision internally as well, to change the cause of the basis of that decision too. It is very hard to give a clear answer because the current government's complete denial, let's say, in actions, but it also keeping an eye on the international developments, but also the way the opposition or the people who are critical of the ongoing situation in the country, how those type of developments feed into their own actions in Turkey. It's a kind of, it has lots of relations, lots of parts on Turkey's end. But I want to be optimistic and say that if that decision is going to be taken, it will have to have a positive impact on the case individually and in general in the discussions around the systemic human rights issues in the country.
Thank you. And I think it says something that the case of Osman Kavala is a case to demonstrate to civil society as such that their action is not free. In a sense, when the trial, when someone reads that indictment, and I'm talking about the Gezi trial, the first one, because then all of the rest is cut and paste of going on that. Reading that indictment gave me the message pretty clear. It doesn't matter what you did. We are going to invent something very clearly to go after people who criticize, because that's really who actually challenge policies or that protest against policies. And the question is how random it is. And I'm wondering, would the fact of being put on the spot as much with an infringement proceeding actually probably creates, at least, as you say, a discussion or certain judges, institutions to actually be a bit more careful before actually going ahead with this kind of accusations, and maybe may give a bit of breath to civil society? Emma, what do you think? Is there any hope for civil society in Turkey?
Yeah, I mean, I do think that this whole prosecution of Osman Kavala, of course, is directed at civil society more broadly, and I think there has been an unprecedented amount of media attention on this case from other civil society organizations. If you look at, there are lots of joint statements by domestic NGOs in Turkey focusing on the Osman Kavala case as emblematic. And I think, increasingly we've seen a wider platform of civil society getting together and joining forces. So the civil society in Turkey does continue to be quite vibrant in the face of these enormous setbacks and this chilling effect of a trial like this. I think one thing that's often left out of the picture is that the year in which Osman Kavala was detained, 2017, also saw another very big trial of human rights defenders who had an education workshop on Büyükada, an island off Istanbul. And that trial, led to their detention for a few months. One of them was detained for 14 months. And it's almost as if that happened first in the summer of 2017. And then when they were released, Osman Kavala was immediately detained a few days later, and he then became the next sort of target. But their trial went on, and their trial is still before the Court of Cassation. There's no decision in that trial. Some of them got acquittals, some of them got sentenced and got penalties, but the trial isn't over. It's out of the public eye. But, it does spell the way in which this is not only about Osman Kavala. There were others before him. There have been others after him detained for their work in civil society. I think one of the things about infringement proceedings, though, is that once we go down that track, there's another case waiting in the wings as well, which can also follow. And that case is the case of Selahattin Demirtas, an even bigger judgment in a way than the judgment in the Osman Kavala case, because it's a judgment at the Grand Chamber level of the ECHR. It's a judgment which has, it's enormously rich in its scope. You can mine that judgment for many, many things about the dysfunctionality of the Turkish justice system, the misuse of terrorism laws, the targeting of oppositionists. It's all in that judgment. Even though it relates to one man, it relates actually to a much wider section of the society, of Kurdish political activists especially. Now that is waiting in the wings, that case. Of course, it came after the Osman Kavala judgment, so it's newer. But, if we go down the road of infringement proceedings with Osman Kavala's decision, then we may go in the same direction, logically, with the Selahattin Demirtas decision. And then we're really building up the sense in which this is a systemic pattern, which isn't only about civil society, it's about political opposition in Turkey, it's about Kurds. And then, we can also arguably get into other sections of where there have been other very important judgments. They won't go to infringement proceedings ever, but they're important. The judgment a few days ago concerning 427 judges and prosecutors who were arbitrarily detained. Now, they didn't, when they applied to the European Court, they applied separately and their case was merged. They didn't ask for an Article 18 violation to be found. They didn't claim that their detention was politically motivated, was an abuse of power. So therefore the court didn't find on that, I guess, but could have done, because that's also a scandalous judgment and not a typical judgment concerning 427 members of the judiciary and prosecutorial services. It's pretty extraordinary. I think that's a judgment we can discuss separately, because it's a huge subject and it's very problematic in its own right, that other judgment, for other reasons. But to come back, to pull this together, I think the infringement proceedings issue, which we're up against now and tomorrow maybe starting to be discussed, can have a future as well in potentially the Selahattin Demirtas case too.
Thank you. And I take that as an open invitation I now bring to all of you to discuss actually the case of judges before the European Court of Human Rights in another episode, because really I think there is a lot to say on those kind of cases. So we can see really that there is a lot of systemic going on, and that we need a decision that actually probably sets also the field for the future, in a sense, for other bodies to see, and also probably, in a sense, for Turkish courts and particularly the constitutional court to actually see that they are under watch and that the practices of simply throwing a ball ahead and ahead is not being bought by Council of Europe institution, and this situation I think is important also for the entire human rights system of Europe, because there is a moment in which that if it's apparent that a country can simply bring new accusations on the same facts all over and basically play with the system of the court, then the system of the court fails. But the question is really, what's next? I want to ask Kerem Altiparmak, because you mentioned exactly the Demirtas, which is the other systemic case, and what's going to happen next, in a sense?
Thank you, Massimo. I think now Kavala and rule of law crisis of Turkey has become a rule of law crisis for the Council of Europe, because how you're going to get your decisions to be implemented by the member states. If an institution cannot implement its decisions by its members, then you're in crisis, because if one country does not respect the judgment of the European Court of Human Rights, then others will have the right to do the same thing. And when it comes to Turkey, as Emma stated, it's not just about Kavala, it's not just about Demirtas, it's about 430 judges, 500 something are pending before the court. It's highly likely that in a couple of months the court will decide. So we're talking about a country who arbitrarily detains thousands of judges and prosecutors, and then it's not a isolated rule of law problem for a single country, but now it's a systemic problem. And I suspect the question is whether the European Convention system is adequate to solve this problem. So I think at the next step, first of all, I think there's no way to escape from this infringement proceedings. Later or sooner, it should start, but it will not the end of the road that we started. Then we will have to face general measures that affects millions of people in the country. Judges, prosecutors, MPs, journalists, civil rights activists. And I think we will have to think about how to implement general measures in countries like Turkey, because yes, the judgment about 430 judges were delivered last week, but before then, in 3 separate judgments, Alparslan Altan, Erdal Tercan, and Baş judgments, the European Court already found that the Turkish implementation of Turkish Criminal Code was in violation of Article 5 of the Convention, and Constitutional Court plus the Court of Cassation ignored the judgments of the European Court of Human Rights and continued to keep judges and prosecutors in prison. Similarly, in insult to president cases, tens of thousands of people are on trial for insulting to the president, and there's an Article 46 judgment from the European Court of Human Rights. And in our daily practice at the courts, we face again and again same accusations made by prosecutors. People are convicted by criminal courts, fully ignored the jurisprudence of the European Court of Human Rights. So I think at the next step, we need to think about how to tackle problems created by countries who systematically resist the judgments of the European Court of Human Rights. I think that's why Turkey and Kavala is a very critical example to start with.
Thank you very much. I don't know if anyone else has anything to add. I think we made our time. We are really sharp in the hour. If not, really, thank you so much for having clarified at least what's at stake tomorrow. And I think to the next one, thank you very much, Başak, Ayşe, Emma, and Kerem. and see you on the next one. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.